I build a lot of decks, or at least I start working on a lot of decks. However, the vast majority of these die before ever reaching completion and acquisition. Most of the time, I won't get very far at all. I'll spend maybe 20 or 30 minutes digging around and throwing stuff in a list before identifying something I don't like about the deck. Usually either that I don't like the plan I had in mind, or that the plan I had in mind isn't going to be consistently executable. In this video, I want to talk about a different set of decks, though. The decks that do pass that initial weed out phase, that seem like promising ideas, that I spend hours completing a somewhat polished list for, but which I have since abandoned, never to be returned to. To me, these are just drafts clogging up my Architect account that I might look back at as a reference point later, but I think they can actually serve as an instructive tool for thinking about what makes a deck idea that initially seems good, actually good, truly worth constructing and trying to play with. Because the reality is that a lot of decks don't actually deserve to be finished, and being able to identify when you shouldn't finish a deck based on your own preferences will save you precious time and prevent you from boring yourself trying to play dead on arrival junk piles. I want to begin with perhaps the most obviously flawed idea, a Rograkh Thrasios Polymorph deck I nicknamed TurboStacks. The idea here was pretty simple. Rograkh is a zero-cost creature in the command zone, which gives an easy polymorph target, and Thrasios is a sweet utility creature that gets me into two other colors that I want to be in. The 8 creatures we're using our polymorph spells to spin into are mostly big generic bombs with some sort of nasty way to slow down our opponents attached. Niv-Mizzet Perun, Hullbreaker Horror, 2 different Jink Ataxiae, you get the picture. On top of this, 3 of our 10 creature polymorph spells also target artifacts, and we add an extra artifact polymorph spell to help us pop out one of our 3 key artifacts. Nexus of Becoming as an engine, Godpharaoh statue as a powerful stacks piece, and Proteus Staff as a repeatable polymorph effect. To support this dual-type polymorphing game plan, this deck would run a bunch of creature token generators and even more artifact token generators, which were mostly built into the deck's supporting categories like ramp and removal. The overall goal was for this deck to be a flexible mid-range deck, able to do cheesy polymorph plays, but also to pivot into grindier game plans and crunch value into the late game with Thrasios. And that flexibility was precisely what I found appealing about the deck. Like other cheese strategies, such as Reanimator, Polymorph can feel a little all or nothing. Either you land the big idiot and do some nasty stuff with it, or you fall flat. However, this design of free polymorph target plus value engine in the command zone, along with all the baked-in utility, could mean much better resilience. The deck also had a lot of land ramp sorceries, since that's what was required for its creature and artifact polymorph game plan, and that sort of ramp base along with Thrasios already makes for a difficult to stop engine. Finally, the 3 Commander Storm cards all let this deck come surging back into the game even after it's been shut down, and the idea of Echo Storming to create 5 copies of Nexus of Becoming is extremely tasty. So, what was this deck's problem? Why didn't I end up building it? The biggest issue was that the deck was simply too generic, and generically mean at that. Thrasios plus Ramp is a very generic game plan. All of my top-end creatures were generic disgusting bombs, with 4 being played in at least 7% of in-color decks, and another 3 being infamously oppressive Praetors. The game plan had essentially 0 synergistic core to it, because a polymorph deck with that many targets can't really have a synergistic core to it. The cards it finds can't be anything but generic soul-crushing bombs. Polymorphing is a cool mechanism to arrive at those bombs, but that doesn't make them interesting, either for me or for my opponents. So, the deck got scrapped, never to be returned to. That said, with each of these 3 decks, I think it's worth asking, was there any of what excited me about the original idea that could turn into an interesting deck? Well, Rograkh Polymorph does seem like a workable core as an easy way to grab from a selection of creatures while still having access to a second commander, but I'd want it to be something more specific than Thrasios. If I were to take another crack at this idea, it'd need to be with a partner like Kaidel or Sakashima that has a bit more specificity, and then the things to be polymorphed for would need to be far less generic as well. The tricky thing here would be finding enough different options that the deck would always be happy with. With fewer than 3 polymorph targets, the deck would be in total gimmick territory, while with too many, the deck would risk ending up with a generic and boring game plan once again, or alternatively, a wildly inconsistent one. Finding several different high-cost cards that generally fill the same specific niche within the deck is a tricky task, but that's the only way I'd want to touch Polymorph again as a primary feature of a deck. If you're enjoying this video, you should hit all the buttons you see on your screen, each and every one of them. You can also sign up for my Patreon or a YouTube membership if you want to support what I do here. And you'll also get access to a companion piece to this video, where I talk about 3 more decks I haven't given up on. A preview of that will be at the end of this video. The next deck I didn't finish is one that I nicknamed Goblin Throne, and this one is far more recent. This is a deck built around Throne of the Grim Captain, a 2-mana artifact whose front side taps to mill 2 cards, and which can exile a dinosaur, merfolk, pirate, and vampire from your board or graveyard to flip. The backside is a 7/7 creature with a bunch of keywords that also has an on-attack trigger, forcing opponents to sacrifice a non-land permanent, and putting one of the typed creatures exiled with it into play tapped and attacking. This is a fairly attractive hidden commander to me for a bunch of reasons. The colors are relatively flexible, the creature types it uses feature a variety of interesting designs, the card's attributes make it findable with a number of different conditional tutors, and the front side of it is just a decently costed graveyard enabler in its own right. When I was first deciding what I should do with this card, I decided that Grixis was the easiest color identity to work with, since blue was the primary color for Merfolk, and red was a great secondary color for the other 3 types, that also gave better access to haste. Then, I decided I wanted a commander that was graveyard-based in some form or other, sharing either a graveyard setup or a graveyard payoff with Throne. I'm also a sucker for a low-cost commander, so naturally I stumbled onto Norman Osborn, a looter guy on the 2-mana side and a powerful discard payoff on the 4-mana side. This is a reasonably popular commander, but the pairing with Throne of the Grim Captain is relatively less common. There's a lot to work with here, though. Surly Badgersaur and Flaming Tyrannosaurus as madness-friendly dinos, all sorts of looting pirates, multiple graveyard-friendly merfolk, and basically the entire vampire subtype. We've also got the incarnations to give our stuff keywords when they're in the graveyard, a couple beautifully fitting extra combat cards to let us Grim Captain even harder, and various other unique cards that slot nicely into some role or other. All sorts of cards I find cool and exciting managed to work their way into this deck. Strephan, Cure of the Rising Tide, Captain Howler, Forbid, and Necrogoyf. So, what went wrong? On the surface, everything looks fine. Unlike the last deck, this one decidedly does have synergies. Its creatures do feel more intentionally chosen, and its game plan does seem more unique. Still, my impression of this deck, after thinking about it longer, is that it is simply less than the sum of its parts, and the sheer power of its commander is part of the issue here. I successfully identified that a discard sub-theme within these colors and with these creature types was going to work well, but my commander actually makes that too easy. Whereas other discard-oriented decks I play use unique payoffs like Sharoom or Oxyvagonus that want to be in a pretty specific type of deck, Green Goblin simply lets me cast anything I discarded that turn with a 2-mana discount, turning my cool discard plan into a torrent of generic Magic the Gathering gameplay. Now, this might make it seem like the issue primarily lies with the commander, but really, that's not quite true. Using a powerful, somewhat more generic discard commander like Norman Osborn to support a more specific and textured game plan could be a cool idea. But Throne of the Grim Captain just isn't that cool as a thing to center a deck around. The card itself is a graveyard enabler and a fun payoff that can be a fairly significant singular threat, but it's not really well situated to anchor a game plan. Likewise, the sort of deck construction it encourages, with a split of the 4 different creature types, is kind of fun to build, but doesn't actually create a coherent game plan to be amplified. It's the Volo problem, a card creating constraints that are fun to deck build around, but which don't actually create interesting gameplay on their own. While this deck's cards outside of Throne and Green Goblin have some graveyard and discard themes that kind of work with one another, it was a relatively generic mid-rangey affair on the whole, without enough of an identity to feel like a coherent deck. So, I scrapped the idea. To be clear, I'm not against building a Throne of the Grim Captain deck in the future. The card still slaps, even if I didn't like this usage of it. However, I think it'd essentially need to be in a mostly formed deck, where the card just happened to make sense. A deck where Throne could add spice to a moderately strong existing identity, rather than being expected to create identity all on its own. I actually did a little experiment while writing this video where I tried to slap together a different Throne of the Grim Captain deck that solves the issues I have with the card in this deck. I went Marduk colors instead of Grixis, with Kroxa and Kunaros in the command zone instead of Norman Osborn. It was a sort of graveyard cheese reanimator type situation, with all manner of spicy high-cost dinosaurs and vampires alongside a bunch of graveyard enablers and enough of the other types to get by. This deck had a distinct identity with its different types, a punchy aggressive playstyle, and a bunch of congruence between the Command Zone and Throne of the Grim Captain. The two can work alongside each other, but they're also rough analogs, which is nice for if Throne gets removed or if I'm struggling to keep the graveyard stocked for K and K. So, every issue I have with Goblin Throne is basically solved with this cool Reanimator deck. It's also not the sort of deck I'm really interested in playing. Kind of fragile, and not wildly flexible in its play paths. Just not my cup of tea. This is the challenge of deck building. There are multiple elements that need to line up in order to make a deck I'm building worth finishing, and sometimes solving one set of issues I have with a deck just leads to an entirely different set of issues. What this means is that learning to identify those issues early in the process and hold back on finishing a deck can be a helpful thing. This channel is sponsored by Dragon Shield, and if you haven't already, you should check out their beautiful new line of guild sleeves. These are dual matte, so one side is the guild design and the other side is a solid color that provides a great backing for your cards. Follow my link in the description and use code SALUBRIOUS at checkout for 5% off. The final deck I didn't finish is one I refer to as Enigmatic Control, and this is the one I've spent by far the most time thinking about. The pivotal card of this deck is Enigmatic Incarnation, a 4-mana enchantment in Simic colors that allows its controller to sacrifice an enchantment on their end step, searching up a creature with mana value 1 greater to put into play. Immediately, this is appealing as an unconventional birthing pod effect. Enchantment creatures are one obvious application here, since an enchantment creature can be sacrificed to find a different enchantment creature, just like a normal pod effect. But there are other interesting options as well. Enchantments with ETBs make for nice sacrifice targets, as do sagas, which leaves quite a few different options. There are also a number of non-enchantment creatures to be grabbed that have great synergy with an enchantment sacrificing game plan, such as Tameshi, Harnessed Snubhorn, and Moonblessed Cleric. This deck was looking to assemble a solid toolboxy sort of game plan with some of these different options, although there was a final challenge to be navigated of when Enigmatic Incarnation triggered, on the end step. This is a little bit of a problem for us, because it means we can't get immediate use out of any of the creatures we grab in the way we could with a conventional pod effect. No grabbing a card draw creature to hit a land drop, no grabbing a removal creature to enable a good attack step, no grabbing a synergy piece creature to set up some sweet spells, and so forth. To me, this meant two things. For one, flash enablers were going to be a notable part of our game plan so that we can play more on our opponent's turns, and two, this deck's general plan needed to be a bit slower and more controlling. These two features, combined with an enchantment-centered game plan, also made a particular type of card very useful: Rule of Law effects. Preventing each player from casting more than one spell each turn can do wonders for keeping people in check, especially in a deck that has some counterspells to stop even that one spell, if it's a bit too spooky. Realistically, this means that we need white in our color identity, so it was at this point where I picked out a relatively generic enchantment commander, Tuvasa the Sunlit. Tuvasa's draw is nice for taking a bit of strain off our value engines, and the fact that Tuvasa herself gets decently big with enough enchantments on board also allows her to be a win con for us. This feature of the card is compounded by a few evasion enchantments like Unquestioned Authority and Thassa, God of the Sea, and the fact that these can be simply sacrificed to find something else if the commander beatdown plan doesn't seem doable is a nice bit of flexibility. Aside from commander damage, this deck had a handful of other options for winning, most of them a bit grittier and more controlling. The deck featured Karametra as a god that can give a ton of ramp, and then there are some different options for turning this mana advantage into a lock of sorts. The deck had several different enchantress effects, and these could be paired with Words of Wind to repeatedly bounce a ramp enchantment, stripping away resources from our opponents. The deck also had Fear of Sleep Paralysis in it, which could lock down opposing creatures if we were playing enough enchantments. Both of these are tricky to pull off with a Rule of Law effect still in play, unless we have Heliod the Warped Eclipse in play. But, luckily for us, our deck is built around sacrificing enchantments, so we have the ability to get the Rule of Law enchantments out of there whenever we're ready. Once we were heavily taxing our opponent's ability to play the game, the idea was to beat them down with an army of enchantment creatures and/or our commander. So, why didn't I finish up and buy this deck? Well, there were some pretty fundamental issues, mostly all stemming from the fact that Enigmatic Incarnation is not a very good card. It's slow as a primary engine since it's 4 mana and triggers on end step, and though it synergizes well with the Duskmourn Overlords, there are only 3 of those available in the colors. Maybe there could be a version of this deck where we dip into the 7 other enchantments in the game that can get heavily discounted by certain requirements being fulfilled, but these cards tend to be highly varied and not necessarily conducive to a focused game plan. Now, trying to pump up the strength of a cool but mediocre card is not necessarily a bad time, and that is precisely what this deck is trying to do. To accomplish this, there are two main methods available to enchantment decks: generic enchantress effects and stacks pieces. Both of these are fine, but they do kind of clash with one another, particularly the rule of law effects. Preventing players from casting more than one spell per turn prevents playing more than one enchantment per turn cycle to draw cards, unless some of those enchantments have flash. We could try to make them have flash, but there will still be a natural barrier to overcome every game. I could dial in harder on a strictly enchantress game plan, but that'd lose a lot of the appeal of Enigmatic Incarnation. It makes a lot of sense as a toolbox control card, and if I'm building a generic enchantress deck instead, I don't really feel like I'm building around it. As a final option, we could mostly give up on the generic enchantment synergies and focus on pushing our funky stacks game plan to its limits, but I think cards like Sithis and Sanctum Weaver are kind of required to keep this a mid-power deck. And the lower this deck's power level dips, the worse its identity starts to feel as a stacksy toolbox control deck. Rule of law effects are pretty powerful stacks effects, and it doesn't make sense to fight low power game plans with high power stacks. This isn't to say that Bracket 2 style games should have no interaction, and in fact both of my Bracket 2 decks have above average counts of interaction cards, but the tools being used should be a little lighter duty. So, at the end of the day, I could come up with cool play patterns around a cool card, interesting branching game plans for the deck to run down, but those interesting game plans didn't flow together in a way elegant enough to keep up in the sort of Commander game I wanted to keep up in. I could do a lot of things, and might end up in some powerful situations, but at its core, Enigmatic Incarnation just wasn't a card that could give the deck the amount of smoothing it would need to feel good in the average game, and that's totally ignoring the concept of an opponent melting it with a removal spell immediately. So I scrapped the deck. With all three of these decks, there was something about them that excited me enough to spend a lot of time building them. I had some idea of the possible challenges the deck might face, but it took me a little while to fully weigh what I found cool about a deck versus what about it didn't seem all that workable. With that in mind, there are a couple of exercises I like to go through now when I'm building decks to avoid dedicating too much time to an ultimately faulty idea. The first of these is to think about the basic plan for a deck, and then to consider how likely it is that that plan will actually come together, versus how likely it is that the deck will do something else. Ideally, it's pretty likely that you'll fulfill the specific vision you had in mind, but if it's something more niche, like a weird combo or a hidden commander, it might be nice to make sure that the deck is fun even outside of that. The Enigmatic Incarnation deck is an example of one that kind of works with the enchantment in play, but really does not function smoothly at all without it. By contrast, my Sharoom Astral Slide deck needs the slide to hit its full late game potential, but it's a reasonably fun artifact deck even before that happens. The other thing to consider is how your deck's game plan fits into the context of an actual game with actual opponents. What sorts of decks will your deck be playing against based on its power level? What will your opponent's experience with your deck look like? Will your deck be good for multiple enjoyable games, or will its game plan get stale for you and/or your opponents fairly rapidly? This will usually be the bane of Polymorph and other cheesy strategies for me. These sorts of decks will clear the bar of being cool in theory, but in practice they're often boring to play against more than once, and without that freshness, I simply don't find them interesting to play on my side of the table either. This isn't to say that I can never make a cheese deck work. Maybe a bunch of factors all line up to make a deck enjoyable for me. And it's also not to say that what I find fun is what you should find fun. You might very well be able to take one of the decks I've mentioned today, tune it to your preferences, and then have a blast with it, and that's great. What's important is that you know what you enjoy and what you don't enjoy, and that you're able to check in with yourself about a deck before dedicating too much time to it. Remove the blinders of a cool idea and give your deck a good proper look, and if it's still looking just as shiny, snag that bad boy. Thanks for watching, and thanks to Archidect for supporting the channel. A big part of what makes it possible for me to start building so many decks and not even delete the majority of them is Archidect's folder system. The fact that I can separate my current decks from my prospective decks from all the other random things I do like precon reviews lets me stay organized, even with dozens and dozens of decks on my profile. A link to all of my decks is in the description if you want to check those out, including the ones I've mentioned today. You can also check out my Timna Kedis list I've been thinking about, a deck that I've put on the back burner but haven't abandoned yet. I have a few decks like that, and I talk about them in a bonus second part of this video only available to patrons and YouTube members. A preview of that begins right now. To get into what I like about this deck, I am a sucker for ways to pressure the life totals of all of my opponents at once, as Liesa does, and Kedis is quite an elegant way of doing that. I'm also strangely okay with the Timna. In a lot of decks, I'd worry that such a generically powerful partner would leave the deck in a weird state with its identity, but using it as a beat stick in a full aggro deck makes it feel 100% okay. Give me them cards. You'll also see lots of pet cards for me that feel right at home here. Commander Storm cards, Chainsaw, Brina, Jeska, all sorts of tasty cards. Like the Blood Avatar ideas I'm working with, this deck also fits into a niche that I don't really consider fully filled at the moment.